The lantern light swept across the cotton rows like the eye of some hunting creature, and Tobias pressed his face into the Mississippi dirt so hard he tasted clay and blood. The axe blade lay cold against his ribs, hidden beneath his thin shirt, and each breath threatened to shift it, to make it clink against the hoe handle he dropped 3 rows over. His heart hammered so violently he was certain its sound would betray him, a drumbeat of treason pulsing through the August night. The light passed within 5 feet of his head. Silas Crenshaw's boots crunched through the dried stalks at the field's edge, slow and methodical. The overseer hummed something low and tuneless, a sound that made Tobias's skin crawl. He could smell the man's tobacco from here, acrid and sharp, cutting through the thick sweetness of the cotton and the swamp rot that drifted up from the bottomlands. The Mississippi heat clung to everything, even in the dead of night, wrapping around Tobias's throat like fingers. The cicadas screamed their endless song. Tobias had always hated that sound, the way it built and built until it seemed the very air would split open. But tonight he prayed they would sing louder, loud enough to cover the ragged gasp he couldn't quite suppress, loud enough to drown out the thundering in his chest. The lantern swung away. Silas's humming faded toward the eastern quarter of the field. Tobias didn't move. Not yet. He'd learned patience in his 12 years on Langridge farm, learned it the way he'd learned that looking a white man in the eye meant the lash, that speaking out of turn meant worse, that his mother's screams 3 years ago had ended in a silence that still lived in his bones. Patience was survival. But patience, he discovered, could also be a weapon. He counted to 100, slow and steady, the way old Jerome had taught him to count before Jerome's hands got too twisted with rheumatism to work the fields and Master Langridge sold him downriver. By 90, the lantern was a distant firefly glow near the equipment shed. By 100, Silas Crenshaw had disappeared entirely, leaving only the night and the watching cotton. Tobias rose to his hands and knees. Dirt cascaded from his face, his arms, the axe blade that he now gripped with both hands. The metal was heavy, heavier than seemed right for its size. Calvin had forged it special, had whispered, "It knows what it's for," when he'd pressed it into Tobias's hands behind the blacksmith shed. At the time, Tobias had thought the old man was just being superstitious. Now, feeling the weight of it, the way it seemed to pulse with its own dark purpose, he wasn't so sure. The hole was already dug. He'd excavated it 2 nights prior during a new moon, when the darkness was complete and even the stars seemed to hide their faces. It sat at the base of a lightning-struck sycamore that marked the intersection of rows 40 and 41, its roots twisted into shapes that looked almost like reaching hands. The tree had been dead for years, but it refused to fall, standing skeletal and bone-white against the darker shadows of the living forest beyond. Tobias crawled toward it, the axe clutched against his chest now, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Every sound seemed amplified, the whisper of his knees through the dirt, the soft rustle of cotton bolls brushing against his shoulders, the distant bark of the hounds that Master Langridge kept chained near the big house. Those hounds had tasted blood before. They'd tasted Jerome's blood when he tried to run, tasted Sarah's blood when she'd fought back against Duncan Crenshaw's grasping hands. They'd taste more blood before this was over. The thought should have horrified him. 3 months ago, it would have. But something had changed in Tobias since the night Marcus had pulled him aside in the quarters, had looked into his eyes and asked a simple question: "You want to die a slave, boy, or you want to die free?" Tobias had chosen his answer. And once that choice was made, there was no walking it back. He reached the sycamore and crouched in its shadow, his fingers finding the edge of the hole by memory. The earth here was different from the rest of the field, darker, richer, almost black in the moonlight that filtered through the dead branches above. It smelled of rot and old rain and something else, something he couldn't name but that made the hair on his arms stand up. The hole waited like an open mouth. Tobias lowered the axe into it, blade first. The metal scraped against roots and stones, and for a horrible moment it stuck, wedged at an angle that left the handle jutting up too high. He bit back a curse and worked it free, his hands slick with sweat and dirt, his fingernails tearing against the wood. Blood welled from beneath one nail, he could feel it, hot and wet, though he couldn't see it in the darkness. The axe settled deeper. He pushed it down until only the top curve of the handle remained visible, then began scooping dirt back into the hole with his bare hands. The earth was warm, almost body temperature, and it clung to his palms like it didn't want to let go. He worked quickly now, urgency overriding caution. Every moment he spent here was a moment he could be discovered, a moment that could end with his body swaying from the hanging tree near the front gate. The dirt filled the hole. Tobias packed it down, then scattered loose cotton bolls over the disturbed earth. He grabbed handfuls of dried leaves from around the sycamore's base and spread them across the spot, camouflaging it until even he had trouble distinguishing it from the surrounding ground. It was done. The first axe was buried. 17 more to go. The number sat in his mind like a stone. 17 more nights of sneaking through the fields with contraband metal pressed against his skin. 17 more chances to be caught. 17 more opportunities for this whole desperate plan to unravel before it could begin. But Marcus had been clear, they needed weapons distributed throughout the fields, hidden where they could be retrieved quickly when the moment came. "We hit them at their feast," Marcus had said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was proposing. "When they're drunk and fat and slow. When they think they're safe in their big house with their crystal glasses and their violin music. We take the axes from the fields, and we take what's ours." Tobias had asked what would happen after. Marcus hadn't answered. Nobody talked about it after. After was a luxury for people who had futures, and enslaved people weren't allowed futures, only endless, grinding presents that bled one into the next until death came as a mercy. But 3 nights from now, when the August moon waned and the Langridge family hosted their annual summer gathering, there might be an after. Or there might be nothing. Either way, it would be an ending. Tobias stood, his legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. The cotton field stretched around him in all directions, row after row of white bolls glowing faintly in the moonlight. How many times had he walked these rows? How many pounds of cotton had he picked, his fingers bleeding, his back bent, his throat raw from thirst? The field knew him. It knew all of them, every enslaved soul who dragged their feet through its furrows, who'd collapsed in its heat, who'd died between its rows and been buried in unmarked graves beyond the tree line. And now the field would know something else. Now it would hold secrets in its soil, would keep them hidden until the moment came to disgorge them in violence. A breeze stirred the cotton, making it whisper and sigh. The sound was almost like voices, dozens of voices, hundreds, all speaking at once in a language Tobias couldn't quite understand. He shivered despite the heat. The field felt alive tonight, aware, as if it had been waiting for this, as if all the years of suffering and death had soaked into its earth and transformed it into something else, something that hungered for what was coming. "Are you watching?" Tobias whispered to the cotton, to the night, to the ghosts of everyone who died here. "You remember what they did to us? You remember?" The cotton rustled in response. The cicadas screamed louder. Tobias turned toward the slave quarters, visible as a cluster of dark shapes in the distance. He'd need to retrieve his hoe first, then make his way back to his cabin before anyone noticed his absence. Morning came early on Langridge Farm, it always did. The bell would ring at dawn, and he'd be expected in the fields with the others, picking cotton until his hands bled, pretending nothing had changed, pretending he was still just Tobias, the quiet boy who kept his head down and his mouth shut. But something had changed. He'd buried an axe in the earth, and that single act had transformed him into something new, something dangerous. He was no longer just a victim of the plantation's cruelty. He was an instrument of its destruction. The thought filled him with a dark exhilaration that was almost indistinguishable from terror. He found his hoe and slung it over his shoulder, then began the long walk back across the field. Behind him, the lightning-struck sycamore stood sentinel over its secret. Ahead, the quarters waited, full of sleeping people who'd wake to another day of bondage, unaware that beneath their feet, buried in the very soil they'd tilled for years, vengeance was taking root. Tobias's shadow stretched long behind him, cast by the setting moon. It looked larger than he was, darker, like it belonged to someone, or something, else entirely. He didn't look back at it. Didn't want to see what shape it might take in the uncertain light. The cicadas followed him all the way home, their song building and building until it sounded less like insects and more like the distant screaming of souls who'd finally found their voices. 17 more axes. 17 more nights. The cotton would remember them all. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe to stay with us through the shadows, and drop a comment below telling us what you think will happen next. The bell rang at dawn, as it always did, its iron voice splitting the morning quiet like an axe through wood. Tobias jerked awake on his pallet, his hands instinctively curling into fists before he remembered where he was, who he was supposed to be. Just a boy. Just a slave. Nothing more. His fingernails were still packed with dirt from the night before. He scraped them clean against the rough wood of the cabin floor while the others stirred around him, his Uncle Benjamin groaning as his arthritic joints protested movement, young Thomas whimpering in his sleep, old Esther muttering prayers that had lost their words years ago and become just sound, just rhythm, just another way to mark time until death. The cabin smelled of unwashed bodies and sickness and despair, smells so familiar Tobias barely noticed them anymore. But this morning, underneath it all, he swore he could smell metal. Cold iron and possibility. He pulled on his shirt, the same one from last night, thin as paper and stained with field dirt, and stumbled out into the gray pre-dawn light. Others were emerging from their cabins like shadows gaining substance, moving toward the bell's summons with the automaticity of broken things. No one spoke. Speaking before the breakfast ration was a waste of energy they couldn't afford. Silas Crenshaw stood beside the bell, one hand still on the rope, the other resting on the coiled whip at his belt. He was a tall man, raw-boned and sun-weathered, with eyes the color of dirty ice. Those eyes swept over the assembling enslaved people with the same expression a farmer might use when counting livestock. Not quite human attention. Something colder. Row 40 through 60 today, Silas announced, his voice carrying across the yard. Master Langridge wants them picked clean before the party preparations begin. Anyone leaves cotton on the stalk, you'll answer me. His hand patted the whip. And to this. Tobias felt his stomach drop. Rows 40 through 60. That included row 41. That included the lightning-struck sycamore and the axe buried beneath it. He kept his face blank, his eyes downcast, his posture submissive. But inside, his mind raced. He'd have to work that section, would have to pass the sycamore dozens of times throughout the day, would have to pretend there was nothing special about that spot, nothing hidden, nothing waiting. And he'd have to do it under Silas's watchful gaze. Behind Silas, his nephew Duncan emerged from the overseer's cabin, still buttoning his shirt. Duncan Crenshaw was 22 and cruel in the way that young men with too much power and too little character often became. He'd been overseeing Langridge Farm for 2 years now, ever since his father's plantation in Alabama had failed, and in those 2 years he'd earned a reputation that made even Silas seem merciful by comparison. "Morning, Uncle," Duncan drawled, squinting at the assembled enslaved people. His gaze lingered on the women, particularly on Miriam, who stood near the back with her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Duncan smiled, and Tobias felt rage flare hot in his chest. He swallowed it down. Rage was a luxury, a danger. Rage got you killed. The rations were distributed, cornmeal mush and a strip of salt pork so small it was almost insulting, and then they were marching to the fields, the eastern sky bleeding pink and gold as the sun prepared to make its burning appearance. The beauty of it was obscene against what it illuminated, row after row of cotton stretching toward the horizon, white and waiting, hungry for their blood and sweat and years. Tobias took his position in row 43, canvas sack slung over his shoulder. Around him, others did the same, spreading out along their assigned rows with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this 10,000 times before. To his left, 3 rows over, he could see Miriam settling into her row, her dark blue head wrap bright against the white cotton. To his right, old Ezekiel moved slowly, his back permanently bent from decades in these fields. "Pick clean," Silas called from his position at the row's end, where he could see everyone. "And pick fast. We're burning daylight." Duncan had positioned himself at the opposite end, creating a corridor of surveillance. Between them, there was no escape, no privacy, no moment unwatched. This was the architecture of slavery, not just the chains and whips, but this constant observation that turned every gesture into a potential transgression, every glance into a threat. Tobias began to pick. The cotton bolls were soft beneath his fingers, the familiar texture almost soothing in its monotony. Pluck, drop in the sack, move forward. Pluck, drop, move. The rhythm was hypnotic, designed to erase thought, to reduce a person to nothing but hands and back and endurance. But Tobias let his mind wander even as his hands worked, let his eyes track the landscape of the field, noting landmarks, calculating distances, mapping hiding places for the axes yet to come. The lightning-struck sycamore was visible from here, its white branches stark against the green of the forest beyond. Tobias forced himself not to stare at it, to give it no more attention than any other tree. But he felt its presence like a weight, like a secret pressed against his chest. A humming started from somewhere to his left. Low and melodic, almost lost beneath the rustle of cotton and the morning birdsong. Tobias recognized it immediately, Miriam's voice, carrying the coded warning she'd been using for weeks now. The tune was an old spiritual, but she'd changed the rhythm, added pauses in specific places. It meant, they're watching close today. Be careful. He didn't acknowledge it, didn't look her way. That was the rule. The songs carried messages, but you never showed you understood them, never responded in any way that might draw attention. The overseers knew the enslaved people sang while they worked, it was expected, even encouraged. Master Langridge liked to tell his dinner guests that his slaves were happy, that they sang in the fields. The thought would have been funny if it weren't so obscene. But the songs held rebellion in their rhythm, defiance in their pauses. The overseers heard the melody. The enslaved heard plans. Tobias picked faster, working his way down the row. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat, that brutal Mississippi heat that turned the air thick and hard to breathe, that made sweat run in rivers and cotton stick to bloody fingers. His sack grew heavier. His back began to ache. This was the grind of it, the endless, soul-crushing monotony that broke people faster than any whip. You there, boy. Tobias's heart stopped. He turned to find Duncan Crenshaw walking toward him, boots kicking up dust, a sneer on his sunburned face. Yes, sir. Tobias kept his voice small, subservient. Duncan stopped beside him, close enough that Tobias could smell the whiskey on his breath. The man had been drinking already, despite the early hour. You're picking slow. What's the matter? Hands too delicate for work? No, sir. I'll pick faster, sir. You better. Duncan's hand shot out and gripped Tobias's shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. I've got my eye on you, boy. You and your whole row. Something feels off today, you understand. Something in the air. Tobias's blood turned to ice. Did Duncan know? Had someone talked? Had last night's burial been seen after all? Don't know what you mean, sir, he whispered. Duncan stared at him, those pale eyes searching for something, some sign of deception. Tobias kept his face slack, his body still, every muscle screaming at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand here and take this scrutiny. But he was good at this, he'd spent 12 years learning how to be invisible, how to make himself small enough to overlook. Finally, Duncan released him with a shove that sent him stumbling. Get back to work. And faster this time. Yes, sir. Duncan moved on, prowling down the rows like a predator scenting prey. Tobias's hands shook as he returned to picking, but he couldn't let it show, couldn't let anyone see the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. That was the true horror of this place, not just the physical violence, but the psychological torture of constant surveillance, of never knowing when a look or a word or a moment's hesitation might bring down punishment. The morning stretched into the afternoon. The sun became a hammer beating down on their heads and backs. 2 people collapsed from the heat, Martha, who was 60 if she was a day, and young Timothy, who'd been sick with fever for a week but hadn't been allowed rest. Silas ordered them dragged to the shade at the field's edge and left there. If they recovered, they'd work tomorrow. If they didn't, they'd be buried in the paupers section beyond the tree line. This was the calculation of slavery, bodies were valuable, but only while they could work. After that, they were just disposal problems. Tobias's row brought him closer to the lightning-struck sycamore. He could see it clearly now, and could see the exact spot where the axe lay buried. The disturbed earth had settled overnight, and his camouflage had worked, there was no visible sign of digging. But knowing what was underneath made the spot glow in his mind like a beacon, like a fire that surely everyone could see. He forced himself to pick past it without pausing, without even glancing down. Just another patch of earth. Nothing special. Nothing hidden. Tobias. The voice was barely a whisper, so quiet he almost missed it beneath the cotton's rustle. He looked up to find Ezekiel working the row adjacent to his, close enough now that their paths had converged. The old man didn't look at him, kept his gnarled hands moving through the cotton, but his lips moved in the smallest of whispers. Second one tonight. Calvin's got it ready. Tobias's pulse quickened. He gave the tiniest of nods, then moved on, putting distance between himself and Ezekiel before anyone noticed they'd been close. The message was clear, tonight, he'd hide the second axe. The plan was moving forward. But so was the danger. Row break. Silas called from his position. 10 minutes for water. Then back to it. The enslaved people moved toward the water barrels at the field's edge, a shuffling mass of exhausted humanity. Tobias joined them, grateful for even this brief respite. The water was warm and tasted of wood and rust, but it was wet, and that was enough. A small figure appeared at his elbow, Delilah, the house servant's daughter, barely 8 years old and small for her age. She had large, dark eyes that still held something the adult's eyes had lost. Not quite hope, but not quite hopelessness either. Something in between. Miss Ruth says to tell you the guests start arriving the day after tomorrow, Delilah whispered, her voice high and childlike. She didn't understand what she was carrying, didn't know she was part of the conspiracy. To her, she was just running messages for the adults, playing a game. Says the kitchen's already preparing the feast. Thank you, Delilah, Tobias murmured. The day after tomorrow. That meant he had less time than he'd thought. The revolt was scheduled for the feast night, when the plantation owners would be gathered in the big house, drunk and distracted. But if guests were arriving early, if the schedule was moving up, he'd need to hide the axes faster. All 17 of them, buried and mapped and ready. 2 nights wouldn't be enough if he only hid 1 per night. His mind raced through the possibilities. Could he hide multiple axes in 1 night? The risk would multiply with each trip to the fields, each minute spent exposed and vulnerable. But what choice did he have? Back to work. Duncan's voice cracked across the field like a whip. Water breaks over. They returned to the rows. The afternoon sun was merciless now, turning the field into a furnace. Tobias's vision swam with heat, shimmer and exhaustion, but he kept picking, kept moving, kept maintaining the fiction of submission. Around him, others did the same, Miriam with her humming, Ezekiel with his slow, methodical movements, Marcus working 4 rows over with a fury in his hands that spoke of barely controlled rage. They were all hiding. All pretending. All wearing masks that had become so familiar they felt like faces. But underneath the masks, something was growing. Something dark and sharp and terrible. Silas walked the rows, his eyes never resting, searching for something he couldn't name but could sense the way an animal senses a coming storm. His hand stayed near his whip, fingers twitching. Duncan, too, seemed agitated, more vicious than usual, as if the very air had turned against him and he couldn't understand why. The paranoia was mutual now. The overseers felt it, that shift in atmosphere, that subtle change in the enslaved people's bearing that they couldn't quite articulate. Something was different. Something was wrong. They just didn't know what. Not yet. But they would. In 2 days, when the axes came up from the earth like resurrection, like judgment, they would understand everything. The sun began its descent toward the western tree line. Shadows lengthened across the cotton, and the white bowls took on a golden cast that was almost beautiful. Almost. Weigh in. Silas called. 1 by 1, they brought their sacks to be weighed and recorded. Tobias's sack was 43 pounds, a good haul, enough to avoid punishment. He watched as Silas marked it down in his ledger, reducing Tobias's day to a single number, his worth measured in pounds of picked cotton. This was what they were to Langridge, to Silas, to Duncan and all the rest, numbers in a ledger. Property with a price tag. Things that picked cotton and made money and could be bought and sold and disposed of when they broke. But things didn't bury axes in fields. Things didn't plot revolt in the darkness. Things didn't carry rage like fire in their chests. The enslaved people were marched back to the quarters as the sun touched the horizon. Dinner would be the same as breakfast, cornmeal mush, maybe some greens if they were lucky. Then darkness, and another night of fitful sleep before the bell rang again, before the cycle repeated, before they returned to the fields and the watching and the endless, grinding horror of it all. But tonight, Tobias wouldn't sleep. Tonight, he had work to do. He glanced back at the field as they walked away, at the lightning-struck sycamore standing sentinel over its buried secret. In the failing light, the tree looked less like wood and more like bone, a skeleton reaching toward a sky that offered no mercy, no salvation, only the cold indifference of stars that had watched this same scene play out 1,000 times. The cotton rustled in the evening breeze, whispering its secrets to the coming darkness. 17 more axes. 2 more nights. The watchers would keep watching. But they wouldn't see what was coming until it was too late to stop it. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if this story is sending chills down your spine, and comment below with your thoughts. We read every single one. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black Mississippi sky when Tobias slipped from his cabin. He moved like smoke through the darkness, his bare feet finding the path by memory rather than sight. The quarters were silent behind him, even the usual sounds of restless sleep and whispered prayers had faded into an absence so complete it felt like death. But Tobias knew better than to trust silence. Silence could be watching. Silence could be waiting. The blacksmith shed sat at the edge of the compound, close enough to the big house to be convenient but far enough from the quarters to keep its heat and noise from disturbing Master Langridge's rest. Calvin had worked there for 30 years, since before Tobias was born, since before Tobias's mother had been sold away screaming. Calvin's hands were twisted now with burns and old breaks that had healed wrong, but they still knew iron, still understood the language of metal and fire. And Calvin understood other things too. Darker things. Tobias approached from the back, where the shadows were deepest and the sight lines from the big house were blocked by the shed itself. 3 soft knocks on the wooden wall, a pause, then 2 more. The signal Marcus had taught him. The door cracked open. Calvin's face appeared in the gap, his eyes reflecting what little moonlight penetrated the darkness. He was old, 60 at least, maybe more, with gray shot through his tight-curled hair and scars mapping his dark skin like a history written in pain. Those scars spoke of whippings, of burns, of a lifetime under the overseer's authority. But his eyes were sharp. Alert. Alive with something that might have been madness or might have been the only kind of sanity that made sense in a place like this. Come, Calvin whispered, pulling the door wider. Tobias slipped inside. The shed smelled of coal smoke and hot metal, even though the forge had been cold for hours. Tools hung on the walls, hammers and tongs and files, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. In the corner, covered with burlap sacking, were the shapes Tobias had come for. Calvin moved to them with the careful steps of a man whose joints protested every movement. He pulled back the burlap, revealing 3 axes laid side by side like sleeping things. The metal caught what little light existed and seemed to swallow it, turning it into something else, something that made the air feel heavier. 3 tonight? Tobias whispered. It was more than he'd expected. More than he'd hoped. Time's running short, Calvin said, his voice like gravel scraping stone. Ruth got word from the big house, guests already arriving tomorrow instead of the day after. The feast moves up. Everything moves up. Tobias felt his stomach drop. Tomorrow night, then. Not 2 nights from now. Tomorrow. That means we need all 17 axes placed by tomorrow sundown, Tobias said, his mind racing through the mathematics of it. 1 axe is already buried. 3 here. That left 13 more that Calvin would need to provide, and 17 total hiding spots that Tobias would need to find and use before the revolt began. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. Can you do it? Calvin asked, watching him with those sharp eyes. Tobias thought of his mother's screams. Of Jerome's body swaying from the hanging tree. Of Sarah's blood in the dirt after Duncan Crenshaw had finished with her. Of every morning bell that rang like a death knell, every lash of the whip, every moment of degradation and horror that made up the texture of daily life on Langridge Farm. I can do it, he said. Calvin nodded once, then lifted the first axe and held it out. Tobias took it, and the weight was shocking. It seemed too heavy for its size, as if the metal had absorbed something more than just carbon and fire in its forging. His arms trembled with the burden of it. They're hungry, Calvin whispered. I felt it when I made them. The iron wanted this. I want blood. You're talking crazy, old man, Tobias said, but his voice lacked conviction. Because he'd felt it too, last night, when he'd buried the first axe. That sense of awareness in the metal, that feeling of purpose that went beyond simple tool-making. Maybe, Calvin agreed. Or maybe I'm the only one seeing straight. This whole place is crazy, boy. This whole world built on our backs and watered with our blood, that's the real madness. What we're doing, that's just, evening the accounts. He handed Tobias a length of rough rope. Tie them to your body. 1 across your back, 1 on each side. Your shirt will hide them if you're careful. And you'll need both hands free in case you have to run. Tobias set about the task, his fingers clumsy with fear and exhaustion. The axes were cold against his skin, colder than the night air should make them. He secured the first one across his back, the handle running parallel to his spine, the blade resting against his shoulder blade. The second he tied to his left side, tucked up under his arm. The third went on his right. When he was finished, he felt like he was wearing armor made of murder. The weight was immense, pulling him down, making each breath an effort. But when he pulled his shirt over the contraband metal, the outline was barely visible. In the darkness, he might pass for just another enslaved boy moving through the night, perhaps heading to the privy, perhaps checking on a sick relative. Perhaps. If no one looked too close. The dogs are chained tonight, Calvin said. Silas took them hunting yesterday and they're tired. That's your luck. But Duncan's been drinking, and drunk men do unpredictable things. Watch for his lamp. I will. And Tobias? Calvin's hand gripped his shoulder, those twisted fingers somehow still strong. When it starts tomorrow night, you stay low. Let the men do the fighting. You're small, you're fast, you can slip away in the chaos. Find the woods and keep running. Don't stop until you're across the river. Tobias met the old man's eyes. You talk like you won't be there. Calvin smiled, and it was the saddest thing Tobias had ever seen. I'm 62 years old, boy. My running days are done. But I can swing an axe one last time. I can make my death count for something. Don't talk like that. We're all getting out. Marcus said. Marcus is young and full of hope, Calvin interrupted. Hope's a good thing for starting revolts. But for finishing them? You need cold truth. And the truth is most of us won't see free soil. Most of us are already dead, we just don't know it yet. But you got a chance. So when the moment comes, you run. You survive. You remember us. The weight of those words settled over Tobias like the weight of the axes, heavy and cold and inescapable. He wanted to argue, wanted to insist that they'd all escape together, that freedom was waiting for all of them beyond the reach of Langridge Farm. But he'd learned not to believe in fairy tales, and Calvin's eyes told him that the old blacksmith had stopped believing long ago. I'll remember, Tobias whispered. Good. Calvin released him and moved to the door, cracking it open to check the darkness beyond. The path is clear. Move quickly and stay in the shadows. And boy, be careful where you place those axes. The land remembers things. Remembering blood and pain and crying. You put those axes in the right spots, the land itself might help us when the time comes. More superstition. More old man rambling about spirits and remembering earth. But Tobias nodded anyway, because somewhere deep in his bones, beneath the rational part of his mind that knew metal was just metal and dirt was just dirt, he believed it too. The door opened wider. Night air rushed in, thick with the smell of the swamp and night-blooming jasmine. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a low, mournful sound that made Tobias's skin prickle. He stepped out into the darkness. The axes pulled at him immediately, their weight distributed across his body but somehow feeling concentrated in his chest, like his heart had turned to iron and grown too heavy for his ribs to contain. Each step was an effort. Each breath was a reminder of what he carried, what he intended to do with it. The path to the fields lay through a stretch of open ground between the shed and the tree line, 50 yards of exposure where anyone looking out from the big house or the overseer's cabin might spot movement. Tobias studied it, his heart hammering, his mouth dry. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by, but that meant it provided enough light to be seen by. No choice. He had to cross. He moved low and fast, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. The axes shifted against his body with each stride, their edges digging into his skin even through the fabric of his shirt. He could feel blood starting to seep from where the blade on his back pressed too hard, warm and wet against his spine. 20 yards across. 30. The big house loomed to his left, its white columns ghostly in the moonlight, windows dark except for one on the second floor where a lamp still burned. Master Langridge's study. The man often worked late into the night, managing his ledgers, calculating his profits, reducing human lives to numbers that made sense on paper. 40 yards. Almost there. A door slammed. Tobias dropped to the ground so fast he barely remembered deciding to do it. The axes bit into him hard, and he had to clench his teeth to keep from crying out. He pressed his face into the dirt and held perfectly still, barely breathing, listening to the sound of boots on the porch of the overseer's cabin. Duncan. It had to be Duncan. The boots descended the stairs, hit the ground, and started walking. Toward the privy, Tobias hoped. Or toward the slave quarters for a random inspection. Anywhere but toward the fields. Anywhere but. The footsteps stopped. Changed direction. Began moving closer. Tobias's heart threatened to explode. He could see Duncan now from the corner of his eye, a dark shape against the slightly less dark night, weaving slightly as he walked. Drunk, just as Calvin had warned. The man carried a lantern in one hand and something else in the other. A bottle, probably. Duncan had a fondness for his uncle's whiskey. The lantern swung in wide arcs, casting crazy shadows across the ground. It swept within 10 feet of where Tobias lay. 5 feet. Close enough that Tobias could see the light painting the dirt orange, could see individual pebbles casting tiny shadows. Duncan stopped. Took a drink from his bottle. Stood swaying in the night, staring out at nothing. "I know something's wrong," he said to the darkness, his words slurred but audible. "I can feel it. Like a storm coming. You feel it too, don't you, Uncle's place?" He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Slaves getting uppity. Need to remind them who's in charge. Need to make an example." He trailed off, took another drink, then suddenly hurled the bottle into the darkness. It smashed against something, a tree, maybe, the sound sharp and violent in the quiet night. "Tomorrow," Duncan said. "Tomorrow I'll pick one. Maybe that boy. The quiet one. Tobias. Yeah. He's got eyes that see too much. I'll take him to the whipping post, make sure everyone watches. Remind them all what happens when you forget your place." Ice water flooded Tobias's veins. Tomorrow. Duncan planned to whip him tomorrow. Before the revolt even began. And if they tied him to the whipping post, if they stripped his shirt off to lay open his back. They'd see the cuts from the axes. They'd see the blood. They'd know he'd been carrying contraband. The revolt would be discovered before it could start. Duncan turned and walked back toward his cabin, the lantern swinging, his silhouette disappearing into the building. A moment later, the light inside went out. Tobias lay in the dirt, his mind racing. He had to hide these axes tonight. I had to hide all the others tomorrow. Had to do it before Duncan could make good on his threat. And then, when the revolt began, he'd need to make sure Duncan Crenshaw was one of the first to feel the iron's edge. The thought should have horrified him. 3 months ago it would have. But now it filled him with something cold and clear and focused. Not rage, exactly. Something beyond rage. Something like purpose. He rose to his feet and ran the rest of the way to the tree line. The forest swallowed him immediately, its darkness complete and suffocating. Tobias knew these woods, he'd been sent to gather firewood here dozens of times, had learned its paths and clearings and the places where the swamp crept in with its rot and its snakes. But at night, everything was different. The familiar became strange. The safe became threatening. He moved by feel and memory, one hand stretched before him to ward off low branches, the other holding his shirt closed over the axes. The metal seemed to pulse against his skin now, warm rather than cold, as if responding to his heartbeat, syncing with it. His first hiding spot was a hollow oak 300 yards into the woods, where the land began its gradual slope down toward the swamp. He'd discovered it years ago while escaping Duncan's attention for a few precious minutes of peace. The hollow was deep enough to conceal an axe, high enough that casual discovery was unlikely. Tobias reached inside the hole, his fingers brushing dead leaves and the papery husks of insects. He untied the axe from his back, the movement sending fresh pain through his shoulders, and slid it into the hollow handle first. The metal scraped against wood, and for a moment he thought it wouldn't fit, but then it settled with a soft thump that sounded far too loud in the quiet forest. 1 down. 2 to go tonight. He marked the spot in his memory, the hollow oak, 500 paces from the field's edge, near where the land dipped. He'd need to be able to find this again tomorrow night, in the chaos, in the dark. Lives would depend on it. The second hiding spot was more dangerous, a collapsed section of the old stone wall that had once marked the plantation's boundary, back before Master Langridge had purchased additional acreage and pushed his cotton fields deeper into what had been wildland. The wall was closer to the overseer's patrol routes, but it offered better concealment and faster access from the fields. Tobias crouched beside the tumbled stones and wedged the second axe into a gap between two large rocks, covering it with loose stones and dried moss. His fingers were bleeding now, he could feel it, slick and warm, and exhaustion was starting to drag at him like weights tied to his limbs. But he had one more to hide. One more tonight. The third spot was the most exposed yet, the lightning-struck sycamore, right at the field's edge. Too close to where Silas would patrol tomorrow. Too visible in daylight. But it was also perfectly positioned for quick retrieval, and Marcus had been specific. They needed weapons scattered throughout the field and at its edges, creating a net of hidden iron that could be accessed from multiple directions when the moment came. Tobias approached the sycamore with his heart in his throat. The tree loomed above him, its dead branches reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. The first axe he'd buried was still beneath it, sleeping in the earth. Now it would have company. He chose a spot on the opposite side of the trunk and began to dig with his bare hands, scooping out dirt and clay and the twisted roots that seemed to resist his efforts. The earth here felt different than it had 2 nights ago, warmer, almost feverish, as if the first buried axe had infected it with some kind of sickness. Or perhaps that was just exhaustion talking. Perhaps his mind was playing tricks, seeing meaning in meaningless things. The hole deepened. Tobias lowered the third axe into it, arranged it carefully, then covered it over. He was smoothing the disturbed earth when he heard it. Footsteps. Coming through the field. Tobias froze. His hands were black with dirt, his shirt stained with blood from where the axes had cut him. There was no time to run, nowhere to hide. If someone came around the tree, if they saw him here in the dark with his hands in the earth. Tobias. The voice was barely a whisper. Female. Familiar. Miriam stepped around the sycamore, her form darker than the darkness, her eyes finding him with uncanny accuracy despite the night. She moved beside him and crouched, her hands immediately beginning to help smooth the disturbed earth. Saw you from my cabin window, she whispered. Thought you might need help. Too dangerous, Tobias hissed back. If they catch you. Then they catch us both. Her hands worked quickly, efficiently. But they won't. I'm careful. And you need someone watching your back. Together they finished concealing the burial spot, scattering dried leaves and small stones until the area looked undisturbed. When it was done, Miriam sat back on her heels and looked at him. Even in the darkness, he could feel the intensity of her gaze. How many more? She asked. 13. By tomorrow night. She whistled softly between her teeth. That's madness. That's what we've got. Miriam was quiet for a moment, then, I'll help. I can move through the fields during the day without raising suspicion, I'm supposed to be there anyway. You tell me where you need axes hidden during the morning, and I'll mark the spots with cotton tied in a specific way. Tonight, you follow my markers. It was a good plan. Better than what Tobias had been attempting alone. What about Duncan? He's planning to whip me tomorrow. If he does it before the revolt. He won't. Miriam's voice was hard. I'll make sure he's distracted. Duncan's got weaknesses. Got desires. I'll use them. The implication made Tobias sick. Miriam, no. Don't. Don't what? Don't do what needs doing. Her voice was fierce now. You think you're the only one making sacrifices? You think you're the only one willing to pay the price? I've been paying for it for 2 years, Tobias. Every time Duncan looks at me with those eyes. Every time his hands, she cut herself off, breathing hard. At least tomorrow it'll mean something. At least it'll buy us time. Tobias wanted to argue, wanted to find another way, but time had run out for better options. They'd run out of everything except desperate measures and dark choices. I'm sorry, he whispered. Don't be sorry. Be ready. Miriam stood, brushing dirt from her dress. Tomorrow night, when the big house fills with drunk men and music, we'll be in the fields pulling up iron. And then we'll make them understand what it means to treat people like animals. We'll show them what happens when you back a creature into a corner with nothing left to lose. She melted back into the darkness, leaving Tobias alone beneath the lightning-struck sycamore. Above him, the dead branches creaked in a wind he couldn't feel. The cotton field stretched away in all directions, white and waiting. And beneath his feet, buried in soil that had drunk the blood and sweat of generations, the axes slept. But not for long. Tomorrow night, they will wake. Tomorrow night, the iron would remember what it was made for. The cabin was thick with bodies and heat when Tobias returned just before dawn. He slipped through the door like a ghost, his shirt still damp with blood, his hands raw and trembling. No one stirred. Or if they did, they pretended not to. In a place like this, survival often meant seeing nothing, knowing nothing, being nothing but obedient flesh. But Marcus was waiting. The man sat in the corner where shadows pooled deepest, his eyes catching what little pre-dawn light filtered through the gaps in the walls. He was 30, maybe older, the kind of age where a slave's value started to diminish in a master's eyes, where the threat of being sold downriver became real. Marcus had been at Langridge farm for 5 years, ever since his wife had been auctioned off to pay his previous owner's gambling debts. He'd watched her go, watched the cart carry her away screaming his name, and something in him had broken that day. Or perhaps it had finally become whole. Marcus gestured with his chin toward the door. Tobias followed him outside into the gray morning, where the bell would ring in minutes and the nightmare would begin again. "Free tonight?" Marcus asked quietly. "Free. Calvin says all 17 need to be placed by sundown today." Marcus's jaw tightened. "The feast is tonight, then." "Earlier than we thought. Miriam's going to help. She'll mark spots during the day. I'll place the rest after dark." "Good. That's good thinking." Marcus glanced toward the overseer's cabin, where lamplight now glowed in the windows. Silas and Duncan would be waking, preparing for another day of surveillance and cruelty. "You heard about the whipping?" Tobias's stomach nodded. "Duncan mentioned it. Said he was going to make an example." "Of you specifically?" Marcus's voice went hard. "That changes things. If they strip your shirt." Miriam said she'd distract him. Understanding flickered across Marcus's face, followed by something darker. "That girl's too brave for her own good. But if she can keep Duncan occupied until tonight, we might have a chance." The cabin door behind them opened. Others began to emerge, Ezekiel with his bent back, Ruth who worked in the big house kitchen, Jonas whose fingers were gnarled from years of field work. One by one, the conspirators gathered in the gray light, their faces carefully blank, their bodies positioned to look like nothing more than slaves waiting for the morning bell. But beneath the performance, rebellion breathed. Ruth spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Haverford family arrived last night. The Baxters and the Montgomerys will be here by noon. Master Langridge is having the house slaves prepare a feast, roasted pig, venison, all the fine china. They'll start drinking at sundown." "How many men?" Jonas asked. 8 masters, maybe 10. Plus Silas and Duncan. Ruth's eyes were sharp despite her age. "But they'll be drunk by 9 o'clock. Langridge always serves his best bourbon when he's trying to impress the neighbors." Marcus nodded slowly. "We wait until the music starts. Until they're deep in their cups and their guard is down. Then we retrieve the axes and move on the house from 3 sides, east, west, and through the kitchen entrance that Ruth will leave unlocked." "The women and children?" Ezekiel's voice cracked with age and concern. "Hide in the root cellar beneath the chapel," Marcus said. "We mark it with white cloth so our people know not to go near it when the violence starts. Anyone who doesn't want to fight hides there until it's over." "And after?" Tobias heard himself ask. After it's done." The question hung in the morning air like smoke. After. That impossible, terrifying, beautiful word. After implied survival. After implied escape. After implied a future that none of them had dared to imagine in anything but the most desperate, secret corners of their hearts. Marcus met his eyes. "We take what horses we can. We take food and water. And we run north. Some of us will make it. Some won't. But at least we'll die trying for freedom instead of dying slowly in these fields." The bell rang, its iron voice splitting the dawn. They scattered, each person moving to their assigned morning task with the practiced automaticity of the enslaved. But something had changed. Tobias could feel it in the air, in the way people held their shoulders, in the set of their jaws. The performance of submission was still there, but beneath it something coiled and ready, something that had been beaten down for so long it had learned to hide in plain sight. Today was the last day they would wear these masks. Tonight, the masks would come off. Tobias took his position in the fields as the sun broke over the horizon. The cotton stretched before him, innocent and white, holding its buried secrets. He began to pick, his hands moving automatically while his eyes scanned for Miriam's markers. There. 20 rows over, a cluster of cotton bolls tied with a specific pattern, 3 stems knotted together, then 2 apart. The first marker. Tobias worked his way through the morning, noting each marked location, committing them to memory. Miriam moved through the field like she belonged to it, her hands swift and sure, her humming carrying across the rows. The melody was different today, sharper, with an edge that made the hair on Tobias's neck rise. Duncan prowled the field's perimeter, his eyes bloodshot, his movements jerky. He'd drunk heavily last night, and it showed in his temper. Twice he lashed out at workers for imagined infractions, his whip cracking across shoulders and backs. But his attention kept drifting toward the big house, toward the preparations for the evening's feast. And when Miriam passed near him, her hips swaying just so, her eyes cast down in false submission, Duncan's attention locked onto her like a hunting dog catching a scent. Tobias watched it happen, watched Miriam work her terrible magic, trading degradation for time, using Duncan's base desires against him. The overseer followed her toward the equipment shed, and Tobias had to look away, and had to swallow the bile that rose in his throat. This was the price of rebellion. Not just blood and violence, but this, sacrifice layered on sacrifice, dignity traded for survival, humanity bartered in the currency of desperation. The sun climbed. The heat became oppressive. And beneath the cotton, the hidden axes waited like seeds planted in soil that had been watered with too much suffering. When the sun finally began its descent, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Tobias stood at the field's edge and counted. Miriam had marked 13 locations. Added to the 4 already buried, that made 17. All the axes would be in place by midnight. From the big house came the sound of laughter and music. The feast had begun. In the slave quarters, the conspirators gathered one last time. Marcus stood before them, his face illuminated by a single candle, his voice steady. "Tonight we take back what was stolen," he said. "Our bodies. Our lives. Our humanity. Some of us won't see tomorrow. But those who do will see it as free people. Remember, wait for my signal. 3 owl calls, then we move." Tobias looked around at the faces, Ezekiel, Ruth, Jonas, Calvin with his twisted hands, Miriam with her haunted eyes. These were his people. His family. And tonight, together, they would either find freedom or die trying. The darkness deepened. The music from the big house grew louder, more raucous. Through the windows, Tobias could see silhouettes moving, dancing, celebrating in a house built on stolen labor. He slipped into the night with the final axes pressed against his ribs. The cotton fields waited, and beneath them, 17 blades prepared to rise. Tonight, the harvest would be different. Tonight, they would reap what Langridge farm had sown. The last axe went into the ground just as the clock in the big house struck 9. Tobias could hear the chimes carrying across the night air, could hear them mixing with the violin music and drunken laughter that spilled from the illuminated windows. His hands were bleeding freely now, the skin torn and raw from hours of digging, and his body felt like it might simply collapse into the earth he'd been disturbing. But it was done. 17 axes are buried in 17 locations throughout the cotton fields of Langridge farm. He stood slowly, his knees protesting, and looked out across the expanse of white. The cotton seemed different now in the moonlight, not peaceful or pastoral as Master Langridge liked to describe it to his guests, but alive with a malevolent awareness. The plants swayed though there was no wind. The white bowls caught the moon's silver light and threw it back in ways that hurt to look at directly. The field knew what was coming. The field remembered what had been buried in its soil, not just the axes, but generations of pain, years of blood and sweat and tears. Every person who had died between these rows, every child sold away, every indignity and horror and act of casual cruelty had soaked into this earth until the ground itself had become saturated with suffering. And now that suffering was transforming into something else. Something with edges. Something that cut. Tobias wiped his hands on his shirt, leaving dark smears that looked black in the moonlight. Blood or dirt, it was impossible to tell, and perhaps it didn't matter. Both were currencies of this place. Both had been extracted from enslaved bodies for so long that they'd become indistinguishable from the cotton itself. A sound made him freeze. Footsteps. Moving through the field toward him. Tobias dropped low, his heart hammering. Had he been seen? Had one of the overseers spotted him during his night's work? His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for the telltale glow of a lantern, but he saw nothing except the endless rows of cotton. Easy, boy. It's just me. Ezekiel emerged from between the rows, moving with surprising quietness for a man his age. His face was haggard, lined with exhaustion and something deeper, the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. Marcus sent me to find you, Ezekiel whispered, crouching beside Tobias. Everything's ready. The others are gathering at the edge of the western field. We move when the clock strikes 10. 1 more hour, Tobias said, his voice hoarse. 1 more hour, Ezekiel agreed. He looked out across the cotton, his eyes distant. You know what this field looked like when I first came here? 43 years ago, when I was younger than you are now. It was a forest. Beautiful old-growth forest with trees so tall they blocked out the sky. Master Langridge's father cleared it all, burned the trees, pulled the stumps, turned living land into this. He gestured at the cotton. Took us 2 years to make it ready for planting. 2 years of breaking our backs to kill what was natural so something profitable could grow instead. Why are you telling me this? Tobias asked. Ezekiel smiled, and it was the saddest expression Tobias had ever seen. Because this land remembers what it was before. And I think maybe it wants to go back. I think maybe when we water these fields with overseer's blood instead of our own, something old might wake up. Something that's been sleeping under all this cotton, waiting. The old man was talking superstition again, the way Calvin had. But standing here in the darkness with the cotton swaying in a non-existent wind and the buried axes pulsing beneath the earth like buried hearts, Tobias found he couldn't dismiss it. The rational part of his mind knew that metal was just metal, that dirt was just dirt, that fields were just fields. But the part of him that had lived his entire life at the mercy of irrational cruelty, that had watched logic and reason bend and break under the weight of slavery's madness, that part understood that sometimes the irrational was more true than any rational thing could be. Come on, Ezekiel said, rising to his feet with a groan. We need to get in position. They moved through the cotton together, 2 shadows among many. The field seemed to part for them, the rows aligning in ways that made the path clear despite the darkness. Other figures were visible now, conspirators moving toward their assigned positions, ghosts in the night preparing to become something more solid, more terrible. Tobias reached the western edge and found Marcus already there, along with Jonas, Ruth, and a dozen others. Miriam stood apart, her dress torn at the shoulder, her face carefully blank in a way that told Tobias everything he needed to know about how she'd spent her evening. Duncan would be drunk and satisfied, his guard completely down. The distraction had worked. The price made Tobias want to vomit. Positions, Marcus whispered. Tobias, you know where the nearest axes are buried? Row 41, the lightning-struck sycamore. Row 63, the collapsed wall. Row 82, the hollow stump. Tobias recited the locations from memory, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Good. When the signal comes, you retrieve those 3 and distribute them to whoever's nearest. Then you run, you understand me? You get to the woods and you keep going. I can fight. You can survive, Marcus cut him off. That's what you can do. You're 12 years old, Tobias. This isn't your burden to carry all the way to its end. But it was. Tobias knew it in his bones. He'd buried the first axe. He'd set this in motion. He would see it through. Before he could argue, the big house clock began to chime. 10 bells, each one resonating across the plantation like a countdown. Like a death knell. On the 10th chime, 3 owl calls echoed from the eastern field. Marcus's signal. The conspirators moved. Tobias ran toward the lightning-struck sycamore, his feet finding the path by instinct. Behind him, he could hear others spreading out, heading toward their assigned retrieval points. The cotton whispered and rustled, and now it definitely sounded like voices, dozens of them, hundreds, all speaking at once in a language of grief and rage that had been building for generations. He reached the sycamore and dropped to his knees, his hands finding the burial spot by memory. The earth was loose, easy to move, almost as if it wanted to release what it held. His fingers closed around an axe handle, and the metal was warm, impossibly warm, like something alive, like something that had been waiting for this moment. He pulled it free. The blade caught the moonlight and seemed to drink it, to transform it into something darker. A scream split the night. Tobias's head snapped up. The scream had come from the direction of the overseer's cabin, high and terrified and cut short. Then another scream, this one from the big house. The sound of breaking glass. Shouts of alarm. It had begun. Tobias ran toward the collapsed wall, retrieved the second axe, then sprinted toward the hollow stump. Around him, the night erupted into chaos. He could see figures running toward the big house, axes in hand, could see lamplight spilling from windows as the white men inside realized what was happening, could hear the panic in their voices as they shouted for weapons, for help, for mercy they'd never shown. The third axe came free from the hollow stump, and Tobias turned to run back. And found himself face to face with Silas Crenshaw. The overseer stood blocking his path, a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other. His face was pale with shock and rage, his eyes wide as they took in Tobias standing there with an axe in his hands, with dirt under his fingernails, with the evidence of conspiracy written across his entire body. "You," Silas breathed. "It was you all along. You little." He raised the pistol. Time seemed to slow. Tobias saw the hammer cock back, saw Silas's finger tighten on the trigger, saw his own death approaching at the speed of gunpowder and lead. His body wouldn't move. His mind screamed at him to run, to dodge, to do something, but he was frozen, trapped in this moment that would be his last. The cotton moved. It happened so fast Tobias almost didn't see it. The plants around Silas seemed to reach for him, their stalks bending in ways that stalks shouldn't bend, their leaves wrapping around his ankles like grasping hands. Silas stumbled, his shot going wild, the bullet whistling past Tobias's ear so close he felt the wind of its passage. And then Ezekiel was there, emerging from the rows behind Silas, his own retrieved axe raised high. The old man's face was transformed, no longer weary, no longer broken, but terrible with purpose and righteousness and 43 years of accumulated rage. The axe fell. Silas Crenshaw dropped without a sound, his lantern hitting the ground and shattering, its oil spreading across the dirt and igniting in a pool of hungry flame. "Go!" Ezekiel shouted at Tobias. "Get to the woods. Now." But Tobias couldn't move, couldn't look away from Silas's body lying in the dirt, from the blood that looked black in the firelight, from the way the cotton around the corpse seemed to lean in, to drink, to remember. "Tobias." Ezekiel grabbed his shoulder, shook him. "This is war now, boy. People die in war. Now run before you're one of them." The spell broke. Tobias turned and ran toward the tree line, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. Behind him, the plantation had become a battlefield. He could see fires starting, could hear gunshots mixing with screams, could see silhouettes struggling and falling and rising again. The cotton fields bore witness to it all. The white bowls reflected the firelight until the entire field seemed to glow red, and seemed to burn with its own internal heat. And beneath it all, Tobias swore he could feel the earth itself trembling, as if something deep underground was stirring, and was waking after a long sleep. He reached the forest and dove into its darkness. Behind him, Langridge Farm continued its transformation from plantation to pyre, from prison to graveyard. The cotton remembered everything. And tonight, finally, the cotton was taking its revenge. The forest swallowed Tobias whole, its darkness so complete he might have been running through the belly of some vast creature. Branches whipped at his face, roots caught at his feet, and behind him the sounds of the revolt echoed through the trees, screams and gunshots and the terrible wet sounds of axes finding flesh. He should have kept running. Marcus had told him to run, Ezekiel had told him to run, every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to put distance between himself and Langridge Farm until the Mississippi River was a memory and freedom was a tangible thing he could touch. But something pulled him back. Something stronger than fear or survival. He had to see. He had to witness what he'd helped create. Tobias climbed a massive oak at the forest's edge, his bleeding hands finding purchase in the bark, his body moving upward until he reached a branch thick enough to support his weight. From here, 30 feet above the ground, he had a clear view of the plantation spread below him like a map drawn in fire and blood. The big house was burning. Flames poured from the first-floor windows, orange and ravenous, climbing the white columns and consuming the symbol of Langridge prosperity. Silhouettes moved across the lawn, some running toward the house, some running away, all of them caught in the terrible choreography of violence. He could see axes rising and falling, could see bodies on the ground, could see the careful architecture of slavery collapsing into chaos. In the cotton fields, more fires had started. The dry stalks caught quickly, and now entire rows blazed like funeral pyres, the white bowls blackening and curling as the flames consumed them. Smoke rose in thick columns toward the indifferent stars. The field was burning. The very land that had held them captive, that had drunk their sweat and blood for generations, was being purified by fire. Tobias watched as Marcus led a group toward the stables. Watched as Ruth emerged from the burning house, her dress singed but her face fierce with triumph. Watched as Jonas and 3 others cornered Duncan Crenshaw near the well, the young overseer's face pale with terror as he realized there would be no mercy, no quarter, no escape from the reckoning he'd spent 2 years earning. Duncan's screams lasted longer than Silas's had. Movement near the slave quarters caught Tobias's attention. Women and children were emerging from the root cellar beneath the chapel, exactly as planned. Miriam was leading them, directing them toward the horses, toward supplies, toward escape. Some of the men were breaking away from the violence to join them, to choose flight over fight. They would run north. Some would make it. Some wouldn't. But they would die free or live free, and either was better than what they'd had. From his perch, Tobias could see the broader landscape, the roads leading away from the plantation, the dark ribbon of the Mississippi in the distance, the lights of neighboring farms beginning to glow as alarms were raised. Soon there would be militias, posses, hunting parties with dogs and guns and rope. The window for escape was closing even as it opened. Beautiful, isn't it? Tobias nearly fell from the branch. He twisted to find Calvin sitting on a limb below him, the old blacksmith's face illuminated by the distant fires. Blood stained his shirt, but he was smiling, actually smiling, an expression so foreign to his scarred face that it looked almost wrong. "How did you?" "Followed you," Calvin said simply. "Figured you'd do something stupid like coming back to watch instead of running like you were supposed to." He laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. "We're alike that way, I suppose. Can't look away from what we've made." "Did we win?" Tobias asked, his voice small. Calvin's smile faded. "Win? Boy, there's no winning this. We struck a blow, yes. We made them bleed, made them understand that we're not just property that takes abuse without consequence. But winning?" He gestured toward the horizon, where more lights were appearing. "They'll come for us. With dogs and guns and rage. They'll hunt us like animals because we dared to prove we're not animals at all. Some of us will make it north. Most won't. Then why?" Tobias's voice broke. "Why do it at all if we can't win?" "Because dying on your feet is better than living on your knees," Calvin said quietly. "Because some things are worth more than survival. Because the story of what we did here tonight will spread, to other plantations, to other enslaved people who think they're alone in their suffering. They'll hear about Langridge Farm. They'll hear about the night the axes came up from the cotton fields. And maybe, just maybe, it'll give them the courage to pick up their own axes." A massive crack echoed across the plantation. The big house's roof collapsed inward, sending a geyser of sparks into the night sky. The structure that had stood for 40 years, that had witnessed countless horrors and cruelties, was being reduced to ash and memory. "We should go," Calvin said. "The others are gathering at the river crossing. If we move now, we might make it across before dawn. Are you coming?" Tobias asked. Calvin was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the burning plantation. "No, boy. I don't think I am. These old legs won't carry me far enough fast enough, and I'd just slow the others down. But you're young, you're quick. You've got a chance. I won't leave you." "You will," Calvin said firmly. "Because I'm not asking. I'm telling you. You're going to climb down from this tree, you're going to find Miriam and the others, and you're going to run until your lungs burst. You're going to cross that river and keep going north until you find free soil. And then, his voice softened, then you're going to tell this story. You're going to make sure people remember what happened here. The names, the faces, the reasons. You're going to be the witness, Tobias. That's your burden now. Tears burned Tobias's eyes. I don't want to be the witness. I want us all to escape. I know what you want. But we don't get what we want in this life. We get what we can carry. Calvin reached up and gripped Tobias's ankle, his twisted fingers surprisingly strong. Now go. Before I have to watch you die too. Tobias climbed down, his vision blurred with tears. When he reached the ground, he looked back up at Calvin, but the old man had turned away, his attention fixed on the burning plantation as if memorizing every detail, every flame, every shadow. Tobias ran. He found the others at the river crossing, maybe 30 people in all, out of the nearly 100 who'd lived on Langridge farm. Miriam was there, blood on her hands and fire in her eyes. Ezekiel was there, leaning heavily on Jonas but alive, still alive. Marcus stood at the water's edge, directing people across, his face grim with the knowledge of how many hadn't made it. Tobias, Miriam grabbed him as he approached. Where's Calvin? He's not coming. Understanding and grief flashed across her face, but there was no time to mourn. Then we go. Now. They waded into the Mississippi, the water cold and swift around their legs. Behind them, Langridge farm continued to burn, the flames visible for miles, a beacon that would bring hunters and revenge. But ahead was the far bank, and beyond that, the long road north to whatever freedom meant. Tobias looked back one last time as he reached the middle of the river. The plantation was silhouetted against the burning house, and in the fields, he could see the cotton still ablaze, the flames spreading from row to row as if the land itself had decided to purge everything that had been built upon it. And there, barely visible in the distance, he saw a single figure standing at the edge of the burning field. Calvin, watching them go. The old blacksmith raised one hand in farewell, then turned and walked back into the flames. Tobias wanted to scream, wanted to go back, wanted to undo everything that had led to this moment. But the current was pulling at him, and Miriam's hand was in his, and Marcus was calling from the far bank that they had to move, had to keep moving, had to run. They climbed onto the northern shore, water streaming from their clothes, their bodies exhausted but alive. Behind them, the Mississippi flowed on, indifferent to the human drama playing out on its banks. And behind the river, Langridge farm burned. Don't look back anymore, Marcus said, his voice hoarse. What's done is done. What matters now is forward. But Tobias couldn't help himself. He looked back one more time, and what he saw made his breath catch. The cotton fields were completely engulfed now, the flames so bright they turned night into day. And in the heart of the fire, where the lightning-struck sycamore had stood, where the first axe had been buried, the flames were different. They were brighter, almost white, and they formed shapes that looked almost like reaching hands, like faces, like the gathered souls of everyone who died in those fields over the decades. The land was remembered. The land was taking back what had been stolen from it. And somewhere in that burning field, 17 axes were being consumed by flame, their purpose fulfilled, their violence consecrated by fire. Come on, Miriam whispered, tugging at his hand. We have miles to go before dawn. Tobias turned away from the burning plantation. Ahead, the others were already moving into the forest, following the North Star toward whatever came next. Some would make it. Some wouldn't. But they would all die knowing they had chosen their own ending, and had written their own final chapter in the terrible story of Langridge farm. The cotton would remember them. The land would remember them. And Tobias, survivor, witness, bearer of their story, would remember them too. He took one step north. Then another. Then he was running with the others into the darkness, leaving behind the flames and the screams and the plantation that had tried to break them but had failed. Behind them, the threshold of the old world burned. Ahead, the threshold of something new waited in the darkness. And in between, suspended in that moment between bondage and freedom, between death and life, the fugitives ran toward morning.